the New England vampire, identified as John Barber. This is a strange one, and it's also the oldest Doe case that I've ever covered, but it's also pretty fascinating and it's different. And at the same time, this man is really a John Doe, and he deserved to have his name restored. In the 1990s, 3 boys were playing near a sand gravel pit in Griswold, Connecticut. It was there suddenly they would discover a human skull. It was pretty clear right away that this was a much older than expected skeleton. Additionally, it was clear what had been done to his remains had to do with a belief that he may have been a vampire. It put them in a strange spot with the goal to rebury with respect, but how do you do that without a name? It was believed the man passed away in the 1800s, which of course posed a huge challenge. So let's start with what was done to him. Everybody knows about the Salem witch trials, which I know I was obsessed with when I was in junior high. This isn't that, but what happened is similar. The hysteria involving this case also involves New England. In this case, it started with tuberculosis. There was a huge breakout of TB in the 19th century. You will often hear this referred to as consumption, which I actually hadn't until I watched The Vampire Diaries years ago. I remember it being referred to on there, and I'm sure it's in other shows. And what that actually was tuberculosis. And what they believed was that it was the deceased consuming the life of surviving relatives. It's crazy to think of how a lack of information formed horrible things, but TB is horrible. It's a terrible way to die. The people who came down with it would suffer horrible coughs and debilitating pain in their lungs. Essentially, it was untreatable until the 1940s, when a treatment was finally developed. By 1949, they were able to truly start saving people. But back then, 1 of 7 people in existence died from TB. It was a huge number, and it was bad. By the late 1800s, it's estimated that 70 to 90% of those living in cities would end up developing TB. And of those, 80% would pass away from this. So it's understandable why there was such a panic. The richer Americans who could afford it were cared for in tuberculosis sanitariums, which was also an experiment to isolate the sick. But because they didn't really understand the disease, they couldn't really find a way to stop the spread, and they didn't. TB kept spreading. Sometimes blood would come out of people's mouths, and that added to the suspicion and the fear. Back then, they didn't understand the concept of germs or how they spread. Surgeons didn't even begin scrubbing their hands before surgery until the 1870s. So when this man lived, it was in the mid to late 1800s. And TB was claiming the lives of entire families in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and other parts of the East Coast. Because this illness was seen as sucking the life out of them, it was called consumption. So once the person passed from this illness, to stop it from spreading, people would panic and dig up bodies and burn them or pull them apart. People did all sorts of strange rituals. They were afraid and wanted some sort of answer to make the suffering stop. Nearby Rhode Island was known as the vampire capital of America at one point, according to the History Channel. That said, this isn't like the Salem witch trials, and they didn't believe that vampires were walking among them. Or at least most didn't. They were not treating the sick badly or as if they were vampires. It was just after they had passed, because so many were sick that they tried to prevent others from getting it. And when they examined the John Doe's remains, they would discover that he had been hacked and his spine had been disconnected. His chest had been broken open. It was determined he had been in the ground for 5 years before that ever even happened. Which is interesting why after 5 years they felt there was a sudden danger. When our John Doe was first found in the 1990s, DNA wasn't as advanced, and they were pretty much stuck for what to do. Without being able to test him the way we take for granted now, they couldn't know for sure, even though most of the pieces were there. They did the best they could, and they put it aside for technology to catch up, and obviously it did. As DNA progressed, they used his Y chromosome to trace him and came up with a genealogical study that would eventually narrow it down to a farmer named John Barber, who was born in 1788. and the man would pass away in 1842. They could tell that whoever the man was, he had a lot of arthritis, and the pattern of it would suggest he was a hard-working farmer, which was a pretty common occupation at the time. They even found an obituary from 1826. It had been written for a 12-year-old named Nicholas Barber, naming the young man as being born to a father named John Barber. And this helped to suggest they were on the right track. It was believed that John Barber worked hard in his life. The arthritis showed this to be true. Sadly, he would succumb to tuberculosis like so many others, and the coffin found nearby helped to further confirm things. It had the inscription NB13, likely belonging to Nicholas Barber. What was found was actually on what would later be considered the Walton family burial ground. We know that when he was 24, he served in the War of 1812. His widow, Hannah, must have survived, as it's reported she would make a claim for his pension after John had passed. They had 3 boys in total, including the one that was found buried near him. It turns out that the remains found were just part of what was there. It's believed 29 people were buried there, 7 men, 7 women, 12 children, and 3 infants, which is heartbreaking in its own way. Living through adulthood happened so much less often then. The hidden burial ground was mainly used from 1740 to 1830. Given kids were playing in the area, it's likely there were no markings. It's stated that they believed John Barber was an itinerant farmer, meaning he probably didn't have his own farm but traveled to where he would work or wherever someone needed him. So it suggests that maybe the town blamed him for an epidemic that happened later. Because of the way they were doing things back then, it's likely in 1847 that the entire town attended what was done to John. It was normal at the time to celebrate the desecration of the remains with the belief that it would help them not succumb to what he had died from. They found an empty coffin nearby that said JB55 on it. So they had pulled our poor John Doe from what should have been his final resting place. After they desecrated his remains, they reburied him face down with his hands crossed at his chest. In Griswold, Connecticut, our John Doe was not the only suspected vampire. After John, we know that at least one other family was afflicted with TB, and when the 2 parents passed away from consumption, their 2 adult sons would do to them what was done to John Barber, and it was publicized in the local newspaper. Parabon Nanolabs gave the 55-year-old man a face. John was born 235 years ago and passed away 180 years ago. In a strange twist of fate, John Barber would go unidentified for 32 years. The Chicago Jane Doe, March of 2020, identified as Cheyann Klus. When Cheyenne was 22, she was last seen at her home on November 27, 2017, in Downers Grove, Illinois. They know that she traveled into Chicago the night of December 1st, but was never heard from again. Cheyenne's family would keep searching for her, but it wasn't until January of 2023 that her identity would come out. Her remains had been found on March 16, 2020. The police are holding back most of the details surrounding her death. Some reports say she was found 5 years ago and others 2. Her family released this statement. As her immediate family, fathers, sisters, brothers, nephews, are in mourning, we ask for privacy as we grieve the unbearable loss of a daughter, sister, aunt, and human being. We plan to hold a private memorial for Cheyenne amongst us, but we hope that everyone can find solace in knowing that she has been found and respectfully laid to rest. The FBI used dental records to identify her. The Cook County Sheriff is investigating her case. Anyone with information is asked to call the number given. Cheyenne Klaus was missing for 5 years. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss new episodes. So if you enjoy the content here and you're not sure, take a peek to see if you're subscribed. Take care of yourselves and each other.